Foundation's live Spotlight webcast on the neuroscience of memory. My name is Bruce Lieberman, and I'm joined today by two researchers who study how the brain acquires, stores, and retrieves memories. Bradford Dickerson is with the Harvard Medical School and Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston. Mayank Mehta is with the Brain Research Institute at the University of California at Los Angeles. Brad and Mayank, thanks so much for joining us today.
Pleasure.
Over the next 30 minutes, we're going to be taking questions from the public. So please send them via Twitter using the hashtag KavliNeuro. That's KAVLINEURO. Brad and Mayank, can you just take a minute to discuss the kind of work you do in neuroscience? And Brad, let's start with you.
Well, I'm a neurologist, and I see patients with a variety of different types of memory disorders, including Alzheimer's disease. My research the other 4 days of the week is using structural and functional imaging and MRI in particular and other kinds of imaging, as well as behavioral measures to try to understand more about how the brain functions as in healthy adults as well as in older adults who are healthy and in patients with memory disorders.
Great. And Mayank?
So I'm a physicist by training. My research initially was about quantum field theory, and ever since then I moved into the area of brain research, where our focus is on understanding how does brain learn, and in particular how does brain learn about space and time, or simple facts and events which seem to be related to space and time. And to do that, we measured the activity of many individual neurons simultaneously at the microscopic level, and then develop mathematical theories to understand that data, to figure out how the brain is learning anything at all.
Recently, we've learned that how the brain uses and stores memories is actually a lot more complicated than we once thought. Recent work shows that when we remember something that's happened to us, the fact that we remember where it happens is actually really important. And I'd like you to discuss the significance of these two really major developments. Whoever would like to jump in, please do.
So this has been a very interesting, long-standing puzzle. So there is a part of the brain called the hippocampus, which is the first structure to get kicked out or get in trouble in Alzheimer's disease and in PTSD and in all kinds of other neurological disorders too. And when you had damage to hippocampus, you get two very different, seemingly different kind of cognitive deficits. One deficit is you can't remember or learn new things, such as what was this conversation that was going on. After half a minute, you would know what was the conversation. And the other is that people get lost. They don't know where they are in space. So for more than 60 years, this is one of the longest standing puzzles. What has space got to do with facts and events of things that just happen in a conversation? And that's the puzzle that we are investigating, as to what has space got to do with facts and events. And turns out physics has something remarkable to add, because both Newton and Einstein worked on exactly the same idea, as what do facts or events have to do with space. There's a pretty interesting and unexpected set of things that go on there, which we take for granted.
Brad, in general, our understanding of how the brain processes memory is a lot more complicated than we once thought. Mayank talked about the importance of place, but what about this increased complexity that we're now discovering? Is that something that must be something that's pretty important?
Yes, and I think it's really exciting that a lot of various levels of research in mice and rats and in monkeys and humans is all converging on the general idea that there are many parallel streams of information that our brain is processing at any moment in time. Auditory regions are processing our conversation that we're having right now. Visual parts of the brain are processing what we're seeing on the screen or potentially around us. While all of this is happening, at least to some degree, in parallel, the information is ultimately being fed into structures such as the entorhinal cortex, which is a important structure leading into the hippocampus, and ultimately in the hippocampus, where these seemingly disparate lines of information are being bound together and placed with a stamp of time and space on them. And so I think that one of the exciting things is that whether they're studies of the activity of individual neurons that we might be able to obtain in rats, for example, or whether they're studies of pixels of the brain in a sense that we might be able to obtain with functional imaging studies, we're beginning to see some convergence in understanding how the hippocampus helps our brain to bind all of this information together to have this specific time and place stamp that is the signature of episodes of memory in our lives.
So it's not just about the hippocampus. There are other regions that play critical roles, like you said. The those two other regions that you mentioned, the
entorhinal cortex.
That's right, entorhinal cortex and the perirhinal cortex.
Right, and so the perirhinal cortex may actually be important for helping us to process and remember a face and let's say an object. So a person brings a new form of iPad to our office, for example, and the perirhinal cortex is very integral to understanding who that person is based on their face and what that new object is that they're showing us. And then behind that part of our brain is an area called the posterior parahippocampal cortex, and that's helping us more with a lot of the context, so the spatial context and maybe also other elements of the context in which that interaction is occurring. And ultimately, those cortical regions are doing a lot of important things themselves, but they're also then feeding those lines of information into the hippocampus where they're being bound together so that tomorrow we'll be able to describe in words to a new colleague maybe the particular person who brought this new Apple toy to our office and help describe what it was, how it was going to help us with our research.
All right. Well, let's get into right into some questions from the public. There's a really interesting one here, and it goes like this. There are 5 basic types of questions: who, what, where, why, and how. When you have a memory, does the brain store the answers to these questions in separate locations? And then how do these connect? Brad, why don't you tackle that one?
Sure. I think that relates very much to what I was just describing, and in terms, and I do think that there's a lot of evidence that the cortical regions, the areas of our cerebral cortex that are in general much more superficial on the outside, are processing the who and the what and the where. It's a little less clear about the when and the why, but let's just say for now that that our senses are taking in a lot of information about the sound of a person's voice and the look of the appearance of their face and so forth, and that information is being processed and understood perceptually in those parts of the cortex that devote themselves to the vision or to the sound of an experience. And ultimately, I think many people believe that even though the hippocampus and other memory structures are binding those threads of information together, when we retrieve the information later, especially if we have a pretty vivid re-experiencing of that episode of our lives, almost like pressing play on our DVR, it's those cortical regions that are being reactivated in a sense by cues from the hippocampus, and it's, in a sense, the stored patterns that occurred during the original experience are being replayed.
So, Mayank, this next question from a viewer kind of ties in directly to something that Brad was just talking about. How does physical contact affect how memory is used and stored? And that's for Mayank.
Yeah, so that's a great question. It relates to the previous thing that we have been just discussing, that let's imagine you are in a given place, somewhere. Now, you may or may not be in contact with any object at that point. Still, you will know where you are. Whereas, you may be touching some object, or you may be hearing some sound, and you will have memory of that too. Which goes back to the original question, how do physical stimuli, such as touch, smell, sound, instead of being one individual stimulus, turn into something called space, which all animals seemingly instinctively seem to know. The question is how? How do these individual stimuli get put together? It turns out, as Brad touched on that already, what happens is that this structure called hippocampus and related areas, including entorhinal cortex, these areas are not just responding to a stimulus out there, but they're responding to a constellation of stimuli. And these neurons that's how they're generating a concept of space, which we take for granted. And if we didn't know where we are in space, we'll all be dead, because we'll be bumping into things, or we'll not be able to find our food, and we'll be eating our iPhones instead of eating our apple. So it's really crucial. All animals need to know instinctively, how do you generate a notion of space out of a bunch of stimuli. And the cool thing is that not only do we find signature of space in these parts of the brain, but these parts of the brain are doing something very interesting even when the subjects are sleeping. They are not quiet. So subject is asleep, seemingly has no idea where the subject is. You can be in an airplane flying at huge speed. You don't know where you are, but your brain, which corresponds to place, is still active. And it's doing actually something very interesting in terms of generating the concept of space and forming navigational maps and understanding how events occur where in space and time during sleep as well. And that's a very crucial part. And that's where our recent research pointed to how sleep is modifying our sense of memory about space, of all things.
Here's another question from the public, and I think it's an interesting one that, again, follows on what we've been talking about. When you study how memory is stored and used in a human and another animal, is there anything that distinguishes the two, humans and animals? Brad?
Well,
I would imagine there's a lot.
Yeah, that's a really fundamental question, and I guess I would say that there's a lot we don't know about it, but I think one of the biggest things that we do know is when it comes to language. And so one of the ideas about human memory is that we appear to have separate, or at least partially separate, semantic memory systems and episodic memory systems. And so semantic memory systems are like our mental encyclopedia. They have facts and lots of information in them, but they have each of those facts has no particular time and place stamp. So it may be that you can say lots of things about John F. Kennedy, but you may not know anything about really where you learned the information. But when it comes to an experience like JFK's assassination, I think many people who lived through that very much know exactly where they were and what they were doing around that time. And so it's got a very specific time and place stamp that separates that episode in your life from any other episode. And so some people believe that as we retell stories from our lives, specific experiences as humans, we make them almost more semantic. We sort of store them in a different way. And that may lead to some kinds of elaboration, some situations, for example, that may lead to false memory, or situations where another person that was there with you told you some of their experience that they remember, and you start to incorporate that into your story even though you didn't actually have that specific experience yourself. So there are, I think, many ways that our memories get re-sculpted through language, and I think that's one thing that is quite different than the way most other animals experience memory.
Yes, and there are many interesting and surprising similarities as well. Like if you looked at an individual neuron from the hippocampus, it will look pretty much the same in a rat versus human. If you looked at individual neuron in neocortex, it should look like the same like human and rat. If you looked at the overall activity pattern, when the rats are sleeping, you have exactly the same brain rhythms as in humans. When you look at neurons in hippocampus and how their activity is, it looks pretty much like place cell in human and in rat, in the exact same brain region, in the exact same neuron type. So there is the amazing level of similarities on different length scales and time scales and anatomically, even though the brains are, different by a factor of 100 between rat and human. So there is that puzzle that on one hand, the brain is so much bigger in human, but the neurons look pretty much the same. Their activities look pretty much the same. And the functions seem to be similar too. So how did evolution do this? It's a fascinating question.
This is an interesting question from the public, from a viewer, and it says, does the brain's concept of location change when a person is impaired in some way? For instance, in the brain, is location the same for someone who sees and someone who is blind?
Actually, there is a lot of interesting stuff that's going on, some of which we have done, which shed some light on it. So, for example, you can measure the activity of the neurons in the brain that encode space. And now you turn off the lights. Now you check whether these neurons which are encoding space, whether neurons will turn off because the lights are off. Turns out that doesn't happen. And these neurons which are encoding space, they actually maintain the memory of where the rat is, even though lights are completely off. And in fact, people did research in blind rats and found that even blind rats have the same place memory cells. So this could be evolution, this could be developmental change. So what we have done these days is to make a virtual reality and put the rat in virtual reality. So now nothing can tell him where he is except this giant IMAX screen that all around surrounds him. And when he starts walking, the view changes. So the rat thinks that he's walking somewhere, but he is fixed in one place. The world is changing around him. That's the equivalent of the experiment you are suggesting, where a person is in a wheelchair or sitting in a chair and world is going by. Will the cells think that the subject is walking rather than the world is going by? The answer is no. The right, yes and no. Many of the cells behave the same way, whether the subject is physically walking in the world or world is going by. But they have very interesting differences too, which starts to tell us about what space is, and what is the role of our physical movement vis-a-vis our notion of space.
If a person loses one sense, like sight, I would imagine they use their other senses to fix a place or location, like touch, smell, and
that's right. It happens instantly. Mm-hmm. We don't seem to recognize this, but we ourselves start to rely on other senses in our body to start defining what space is on moment-to-moment basis. So to give you an example, you think that you know where you are based on your views of your kitchen, but if you started hearing shower sounds in your kitchen, you will immediately think, hey, something's wrong here. So even though you think you're recognizing space based on only vision, you are keeping in mind all the other sounds and smells and so on and so forth. If you smell bacon in your bathroom, you'll think something is wrong, for example. So we are doing this. We are indeed, our perception of space is indeed based on multiple modalities. It's just that we are such visual creatures, we think it's all about vision. Not necessarily so.
Okay, we have another question from viewers. Brad, are memories stored and used the same way for everyone, regardless of an impairment?
Well, I would say that in general, yes, that memories are processed in the same parts of the brain, the hippocampus and other parts of the circuits that we have been talking about. And so if someone is blind, for example, they don't receive visual information, and those parts of their brain don't bring in that kind of information, but ultimately all of the sound and touch-related and smell-related information, and presumably whatever the person is able to know about the place they're in from those other senses would be processed in the same way and stored in the same way as if they were able to see.
Okay, we have another question. Is it possible to command your brain to let go of a memory? In other words, can you consciously forget something?
There has been some very interesting recent work on what happens in patients with post-traumatic stress disorder, for example, who may have memories that they can't get rid of that intrude on their day-to-day activities and interfere with, in some cases, other kinds of memories. And so these tend to be memories that have occurred in a very emotional context. And so there is research going on to try to understand how that actually develops in the first place. How do emotion systems of the brain interact with memory systems of the brain? And is there a way to blunt some of those interactions to begin with And there are researchers, for example, that have studies going on in emergency rooms where they're trying to give people medicines that, such as beta blockers, that can blunt the reactivity of emotion systems of the brain with the goal of trying to reduce the intensity of those experiences to then hopefully prevent some of the memories from becoming too strong down the line. In terms of forgetting those kinds of memories once they've been established, it's a lot less clear how that might be attempted, but there are people studying it in a basic neuroscience, from a basic neuroscience perspective, trying to figure out whether we can improve our ability to forget things that we do want to forget. I think we're a long way from being able to use that kind of knowledge to help patients, but I think there is work going on in the scientific realm to try to understand how we can help ourselves forget better.
Absolutely, and you can do this interesting cures, that behavioral cures that people are finding, as Brad alluded to, where you can bring the subject to the same place where a traumatic experience occurred, but not have the traumatic events go. And that can play a role in erasing those memories, which were traumatic, by re-exposure to the same place without the same trauma.
Okay, here's another question from a viewer. Do we know how or why a memory starts to change over time? Mayank.
Yes, so we have done a lot of work over a long period of time, almost last 10 years, to see what exactly changes in your brain when you learn something new, which we are doing all the time. It turns out some very intricate pattern of changes occur in the brain when you learn something. In fact, consider a very simple experiment, which is what we did, is to simply walk from your chair to your door once. And maybe the second time you walk there, within that one experience, the map of space which is in your brain would change profoundly. And we know we can measure that change. We know what are the biochemical and neuroelectrical events that are generating these changes. And we know that when this memory trace is formed in the brain within one simple experience, how the trace gets modified when you are not in that same place, especially when you are asleep. That trace is getting modified. So the simple answer to the simple question is it's a very intricate process which keeps evolving both while you are learning and when you stop learning consciously, including when you are sleeping.
On the other side of the coin, here's a question from a viewer. Is there hope for a new method to prevent memory loss from aging and disease? And how close are we to discovering this method?
We found that there is a particular rhythm that appears in the brain, which rhythm that is generated by the brain itself, around 100 hertz or 100 times a second rhythm. That rhythm, whenever it appears, the subjects seem to learn very well. And if you mess with some biochemical pathways or aging, that rhythm gets weaker and subjects seem to learn less too. Turns out as soon as you start running, the rhythm becomes strong. So there is one thing we can all do, which is to have plenty of physical activity, including running. You can immediately increase that brain rhythm, which is known to improve learning and memory. It's a zero-cost cure.
Well, I'd say that there is hope, and I think in terms of common diseases, Alzheimer's disease is probably the most common memory disorder affecting the world's population, and there is a lot of increasing work that is moving toward better treatments of Alzheimer's disease, including understanding how the pathology develops and how long it takes to develop in people before symptoms are expressed. And so there are a number of major studies going on in this country and around the world that are targeting people who are otherwise cognitively normal, but who are over the age of 65, generally speaking, and who may have some changes in the brain that are indicative of early Alzheimer's pathology or risk for that pathology, and trying to begin to either give them medications or in some cases have them do various activities such as engage in particular kinds of diets or engage in aerobic physical exercise to try to see if it can either reduce the pathology or improve the brain's resilience against the damage. In terms of normal aging, I think we're beginning to understand a little bit more about what changes in memory function occur as part of normal aging. And I think there is effort to try to figure out whether either medications or probably more likely lifestyle-related activities, including exercise or including specific kinds of diets or other things such as a good night's sleep, for example, can help people maintain memory function as they get older. So I think that across a variety of fronts, we're seeing a lot of progress in trying to translate some of the observations that are being made in the basic science arena of understanding how memory works into activities that are at least being attempted in studies of people as we get older to see if they can help maintain memory in the brain.
Absolutely, and there is this one part of hippocampus called the dentate gyrus. When mice ended up running more, there were more neurons growing in the dentate gyrus as the mice were running more. So now there is, as Brad said, there's a huge amount of converging evidence that physical activity can actually grow more neurons in your brain and improve the activity patterns.
Here's a question from an educator, I believe. How can educators apply your findings to junior or high school classrooms?
I think one can think about it in two ways. One is what practical things people can do. The practical things people can do in terms of learning and improving learning skills, here are some of them. One of them is simply, I mentioned one thing, sleep is important. If you skip on sleep, your memory is going to get poor. If you skip on exercise, your memory is going to get poor. If you have very bad diet, which is very heavy in saturated fats and so on, your memory is going to get poor. So these are simple things found by a huge number of scientists, the converging lines of evidence that these are important. Simple things you can do which will improve. But there is also a more complex thing, which is this huge initiative that Obama has announced called the BRAIN Project. So with these new technologies that physicists and engineers have developed, it's becoming increasingly clear that brain is an amazingly complex process, probably the most complex organ that we know. It is opening up huge number of exciting challenges and fun projects to work on. So if students start to learn both biology and physical science, they have an unprecedented advantage in terms of doing something interesting and getting paid for it.
I think that there are a couple of very specific ways that educators can bring some of these insights from neuroscience into the classroom. I think that the two things that leap to mind first for myself are sleep. I think that we're notorious for overscheduling our youth and exposing them to so many opportunities that it's hard to find time for sleep. I think it's very clear that a good night's sleep is important for us as we get older, but it's probably even more important for us as during our youth when we're going to school and trying to consolidate all of the information that we learned during the day overnight. So I think first and foremost, a healthy diet and a healthy night's sleep are very important for kids. In terms of actual classroom activity, I think one thing that's come out of cognitive psychology and cognitive neuroscience research recently has been that we learn very well when we're forced to test our knowledge, and we may even learn better when we're forced to teach other people what we've learned. And so I think rather than taking the somewhat more passive approach of studying and restudying material like many of us grew up doing, I think there's increasing evidence that we should be actively testing ourselves or actively testing our knowledge right off the bat in order to consolidate it further, make it more firm, and also potentially really build a foundation on which we can learn the next time we study. So I think that we still don't know exactly what the right balance is between studying and testing, but I think it's pretty clear that early and vigorous testing does help people learn and remember better. And I should say I'm not talking about standardized testing necessarily. I'm talking about whenever we engage in the process of learning, we should be asked to demonstrate what we've learned right away.
Okay, Mayank, an interesting question came from high school students. Do you have any ideas about what kinds of experiments that high school students might do to demonstrate how memory is stored and used in the brain?
Good question. So I hesitate to suggest experiment because I can get in serious trouble with NIH or something. I don't want to suggest anything that can hurt people. These experiments are very tricky, but here is one experiment with those caveats you can do. And that has got to do with one part of the brain that is really crucial for our reasoning and decision making, called the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain which is right at the front of the brain. That part of the brain allows you or plays a critical role in deciding what's going on and how to make judicious choices, not just instinctual choices. Turns out that human babies, until their age 4, they cannot actually make such judicious choices. They can be running, they can be talking, but they cannot suppress their instincts because the prefrontal cortex hasn't developed. So the experiment will be, you take 2 cups, put them upside down, put an M&M or a raisin underneath one of the cups, and let the baby open that cup and eat the M&M. Now, put a partition between the 2 cups and baby. Put M&M underneath the other cup while the baby is watching, and then put the partition down. Let the baby wait for 5 seconds, about 20 seconds. If you lift the partition, a grown man will always go to where you just put the raisin. Whereas the baby won't do that. Will go to the previous place where the baby got reward, even though the baby saw you put the raisin in the other place. So that's a uniquely human trait, and if you try to teach a monkey or a rat to do this, it'll take a long time for them to learn to suppress that instinct, to go back to the same place. As Brad was saying, or somebody else's question, what is it uniquely human? This is one of the uniquely human things that we seem to do as we grow up instinctively, and there is some component of memory there, which we are suppressing. And there is other component of memory which we are acting on.
After our interview, we had the opportunity to ask Brad Dickerson some additional questions that came in from viewers. Brad, how finely can we understand the differences in memory? For instance, I remember the number 5 and the number 4. How would my memory distinguish one from the other?
That's a really great question. I think that one way that I like to think about it is where's my car in the parking lot problem. And so many of us come to the same place to work every day. We park our car in the same garage, usually in a different spot, unless we happen to be have earned a special parking spot. But then we come in, and then at the end of the day, after we've done a lot of things, we have an active memory problem, which is to find our way back to our car. Many of us remember specific instances when we're embarrassed not to be able to find our car very easily. But I think that the point of that is to say that our brains have to separate those patterns that overlap every day. And so there are many patterns of behavior that we engage in, whether they're parking our car on the 5th floor today or parking our car on the 4th floor yesterday. And we have to do our best to try to separate today's pattern from yesterday's pattern in order to actually complete that behavior in an efficient way. And there are certain parts of the hippocampus in particular that have been shown to be very important for so-called pattern separation, which is when there are patterns of behavior that are similar, whether they're things that you're seeing or whether they're things you're hearing or whether they're concepts like numbers. We need those parts of the hippocampus to help to keep those separate and maybe connected with the specific things that they're associated with. So, for example, my car is on the 4th floor today, and I remember that because I was driving in and I saw a colleague walking out from their car on the 4th floor today, and I remember that that actually happened today and not yesterday, so that helps me know where I parked today. So there are a number of co-occurrences or other associated thoughts or activities or perceptions that we have that can separate today's pattern from yesterday's pattern. So that's one element of memory specificity that does seem to degrade as we get older, and that part of the hippocampus has been identified as having some greater difficulty in separating those partially overlapping patterns as part of normal aging. There's also something called pattern completion, which is when we get a part of information and we need to try to figure out, for example, if we're seeing a person's face in a crowd, we may only see part of that person's face, or we may see it from the side, or maybe a view we've never even seen it before if it's a person we just met, and we have to try to decide if that's the person that we met yesterday at the faculty meeting or if that's a different person. And so our minds in many ways have to complete the pattern of partial information that we're getting that in part relies on our memory. And so I think in other parts of the medial temporal lobe and the hippocampus are working with some of the visual parts of our brain, for example, to try to complete those patterns that are only partially in our vision at the moment, and help us remember and compare those that visual information to something that we encountered before, and in so doing that decide whether it's the same or different. So I think those are a few examples of places where certain aspects of memory anyway are very specific, even in the absence of all the information that we may be taking in through our senses.
Okay, another question. My mother fears that she is losing her memory as she ages. She is also concerned about Alzheimer's disease. I feel her issues are related to poor attention, ADD runs in the family, and absence of memory training. Can people over 70 be effectively trained to be more efficient at storing and retrieving new information?
That's a great question, and I think one that many people in this country and other countries are noticing more and more every day as more of our parents or grandparents or spouses are living longer, and also I think as awareness is being raised about memory and aging and common disorders. So I think that the first question really is, should the person be evaluated by a specialist in memory? I think that that's often, there's not a clear answer to that, because when people first start becoming concerned, it's often very hard to tell whether it's just something that we would all expect as part of normal aging, or whether it's something that would warrant a medical evaluation. I think in this country that's partly why some medical systems, including Medicare, are now asking for primary care doctors to screen people's memory every year once they're past a certain age, usually around 65. So I think that the first question is it enough of an issue to warrant an evaluation? I think that there are many reasons that people can have problems with their memory as they get older. Some of those are specific diseases that affect memory, like Alzheimer's disease or stroke. Some of them are not so specific, such as problems that affect a person's ability to pay attention. And as we get older, there are many medical conditions that can affect the brain and cause it to be harder for a person to pay attention to all of the things that that are going on. And that's particularly true when they're trying to multitask. So I think that we often see that in an older person and think of it as ADD, but it's actually a different type of attentional deficit that may be related to possibly silent small strokes, or a medical condition such as those that affect thyroid functioning and so forth. So there can be medical explanations for changes in a person's attention as they get older that certainly impact their ability to remember information, because if you're not taking it in very well in the first place, you're not going to remember it. So I think that some of those can be evaluated through medical checkups. I think many times we get a person evaluated and it's not clear that there's anything obvious wrong with them. And so then we think, okay, they're just getting older. And I do think that it's possible for people over the age of 70 to train their minds, just as it is possible for them to train their bodies. And I think that we haven't done that as much as we should. We certainly haven't studied it as much as we should have, so we don't know what to recommend specifically to people. But there are many ideas for things that people can do to try at least to see if it will help their memories. Some of these are commercial software programs that are sold over the internet. Some of them are programs that academic scientists are trying to employ to see if they work. And so I would encourage people to consider whether they might want to participate in one of those kinds of studies. And in some cases, it's just a matter of trying to become more intellectually active and spend time doing that, such as with reading or book clubs or other activities of that sort. So I would encourage people to get a medical evaluation if they believe that it's a substantial enough problem. I would also encourage people to try to think of their brain just as they think of their muscles and engage in regular exercise of various sorts. And I think that many people do that already and want to look for more ways to improve their functioning. I think it's not so clear what those other ways would be, but I think it's always worth trying new activities.
And Brad, is it true that exercise earlier in life and good habits earlier in life are preventive for losing cognitive abilities and memory specifically later in life?
That seems to be true. I think that we're learning more from studies like the Nurses' Health Study that have obtained information on people and followed them for 20, 30 or more years. I think it's becoming clear that through the nun study, for example, that nuns who were entering convent and who wrote more grammatically complex essays seem to be in better shape cognitively at retirement age. So I think there is evidence for the value of early life experience, and it's hard to tell whether that's actually a genetically influenced thing that enables people to do better at a younger age, or whether it's an environmentally driven thing that has to do with what opportunities they were given. It's probably a combination, but I think that it's probably more heartening for many of us to imagine that we can change our destinies as we get older and not be constrained by what happened before we graduated from high school. And I think there's more and more evidence that mental activity throughout the lifespan and physical activity and a variety of other things, including social and leisure activity, as it's often called, throughout the later ages of adult life into retirement can influence people's memory function and cognitive abilities as they get into their 70s or 80s. So I think that we should always be encouraging people to branch out and to do what they can to try to lead the most active and healthy lifestyle possible, because I think that it's certainly reasonable to imagine that even starting those kinds of habits at age 70 might influence our abilities into the 80s.
Brad, when something is important to you, do you have memory tricks or exercises that you use to remember something later?
Yeah, I think that there's some very interesting research that has been done on people's strategies for remembering. For example, there is some work that shows that some people tend to learn arbitrary information. So let's say you have two pictures of two common objects that are put right next to each other, and there's nothing that would ordinarily tell you that they go together. So for example, a picture of an apple and a picture of a dump truck. But some people may be more likely to envision the information and picture it, mental imagery and that sort of thing. Other people may have a natural tendency to tell a story about it. And it turns out if you put people in a scanner, healthy adults in a functional MRI scanner, and scan their brains as they're learning these kinds of arbitrary pairings of information, of objects, and then ask them how they did it later, the people who told stories about it in their own minds as they were learning the information tended to show activity that was more, that was stronger in some of the language-related areas of the brain, whereas people who did mental imagery or other kinds of visual exercises to try to picture the objects together on a table or in a scene tended to activate the visual areas of their brain more strongly. And in both cases, the people who remembered the items better showed more co-activation between the hippocampus and the memory structures, and in the case of the storytellers, the language structures of the brain, or in the case of the imagers, the mental imagery people, the visual structures of the brain. So it seems like all of these areas are working together, and different strategies may result in different, in people doing better on tasks, and it may be just something that relates to an individual person's strengths and weaknesses. I tend to try to tell myself a story and also to try to generate a mental image just to try to cover my bases so that I can have the best chance of remembering where I met that new colleague the next time I see them.
We have one question here. Are you born with a memory?
I think that's a fascinating question, and having two young children myself, I have noticed some amazing things about their memories from what seems like an earlier age than I would expect. I don't think there's any evidence that I've heard of that indicates that we're born with memories. I think there is some evidence that you can stimulate babies' brains with sounds or potentially other kinds of information while they're in utero. I have never seen a demonstration that kind of information is remembered later, but there is at least some lore that if you play classical music for your unborn baby, they may be smarter later. I haven't seen that really borne out very robustly through research. So in my opinion, I don't think that we're born with memories, but I think we start forming them very quickly, and I think that it's very interesting to think about what babies remember from the time before they were able to speak. I think that's a fascinating topic, and there has been some very interesting research, for example, using eye tracking technologies to try to see what babies are looking at in order to determine whether it seems that they can remember something they've seen before or not.
And our final question today is, what do you find the most mystifying about memory? And how have your own memories surprised you?
Well, I think some of the things that I find most mystifying about memory are how is it that we, first of all, I think that one of the great pleasures that many of us feel is the pleasure of nostalgia, getting together with old friends at a reunion and reminiscing. And I find it fascinating and mystifying to think about collective memory, the memory of a group of people that experienced a time in their lives together that goes beyond what any individual can remember themselves. And I think it's fascinating to just step back and watch those processes and see how the memory that another person may have about an experience can cue your own self to remember things that you would never have remembered on your own without that cue from the other person. And I think some of it has to do with the stories that the person is telling, and some of it has to do with maybe less conscious feelings that we may have when we're around those people that may have been near and dear to us in our younger lives. And I think that can occur 50 years later. So it's just remarkable to me not only how our brains manage to work with other people's brains to have these kinds of collective nostalgic memories, but also how is that information stored over 50 years or more of a person's life, and how is it that they can store so much other information in the meantime without it necessarily interfering in any obvious way. So I think the capacity of our memory is another mystifying thing to me, how it is that over sometimes even 100 years, I've had the pleasure of working with a few centenarians who are healthy, and it's remarkable to imagine how over a lifespan of more than a century, people can continue to record new experience and to relive experiences they had more than half a century ago.
Okay, thank you so much for joining us today. I'd like to thank both of our guests, Brad Dickerson and Mayank Mehta, for joining us. We've had some fantastic questions today, and I really think some amazing, discussion on the neuroscience of memory. If you'd like to see this broadcast again, you can do so by going to the Kavli Foundation website. And if you'd like to follow up and view future webcasts on neuroscience or other scientific topics, please follow the Kavli Foundation over Twitter. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us today and watching. Please keep in touch, and we'll see you next time.